It is 60:14 in the morning, and you are lying in the dark with your eyes already open, staring at a ceiling you have stared at 1,000 times before, and your mind is already running through the meeting you have not had yet, the conversation you are dreading, the bill you have not paid, the version of yourself you were supposed to become by now. You have not even sat up, and already the day feels heavy. Your body is still under the blanket, but your mind is already 3 hours ahead, fighting battles that have not started, and somewhere underneath that noise, quiet enough that you almost miss it, there is a question you have been avoiding for a long time. Why does it feel like life keeps happening to you, instead of through you? You have felt this before, maybe not this exact morning, but 100 mornings like it. The alarm has not even finished its first cycle, and you are already negotiating with a version of the day that has not arrived. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from what you are doing, but from what you are anticipating, rehearsing, bracing for. It is the tiredness of a mind that has never learned how to simply be where it is. And if you are honest with yourself, this has been going on for years. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, just a quiet hum underneath everything, a sense that you are managing your life rather than living it. There is a reason this keeps happening, and it is not the one you have been telling yourself. You have probably assumed it is about willpower, or discipline, or simply needing to try harder. You have probably bought the books, made the plans, promised yourself that this month would be different, and for a few days it usually is. Then the old pattern returns, quietly, almost apologetically, like it never really left. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why that keeps happening, and more importantly, what an entirely different way of meeting your days actually looks like. But first, you have to understand what is really going on underneath the surface of your mornings, your decisions, and your reactions. Most people spend their entire lives responding to the world as if it were happening to them. A colleague sends a curt email, and the whole afternoon is ruined. A friend cancels plans, and it feels like rejection. Traffic makes you late, and by the time you arrive, your nervous system is already primed for conflict before you have even opened your mouth. None of these events are, in themselves, catastrophic. A short email is just a short email. A canceled dinner is just a canceled dinner. But somewhere between the event and your experience of it, something transforms a minor inconvenience into a genuine disturbance of your peace. That transformation happens so quickly, and so habitually, that most people never even notice it is happening. They believe the traffic made them angry. They believe the email ruined their day. They never stop to ask what actually stands between the event and the emotion. Consider a smaller, quieter version of this same pattern, one that has nothing to do with traffic or emails. Picture a woman named nothing in particular, just a person, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday evening, looking at a text message from her adult son that simply says he cannot make it to dinner this week, 6 words, maybe 7, and within seconds, without deciding to, her mind has already built an entire narrative around those words. He is pulling away. He does not prioritize her the way he used to. Something is wrong between them and he is not telling her. None of this was in the text message. The text message said he was busy. Everything else, the entire emotional weight she is now carrying into her evening, was constructed silently, automatically, in the space between reading the words and feeling their impact. This is not a flaw unique to her. It is simply what an untrained mind does, constantly, with almost every piece of information it receives, filling in meaning that was never actually given. This is where the ancient Stoics begin, and it is worth pausing here, because their insight is deceptively simple and almost universally misunderstood. It is not about suppressing feeling. It is not about pretending nothing bothers you. It is about recognizing, with total honesty, that between any event and your reaction to it, there is a space, and in that space lies a judgment, an interpretation, a story you are telling yourself about what the event means. Change the story and the reaction changes with it, not because you are lying to yourself, but because you are finally seeing clearly what was always true. The traffic did not make you late for a reason that threatens your worth as a person. The email was not a verdict on your competence. These are additions your mind made, quietly, automatically, the way it always has. This is the central idea that will run underneath everything you hear today, and it is worth stating plainly before we go any further. You are not disturbed by events, but by your judgments about events. This single distinction, properly understood and practiced, is capable of quietly rearranging an entire life, not because it removes difficulty, but because it removes the unnecessary suffering that gets added on top of difficulty. Real problems will still exist, grief will still be grief, loss will still hurt. But an enormous portion of your daily distress, the portion that comes from imagined futures, replayed conversations, and stories about what things mean, is optional in a way you have probably never considered. Everything that follows is an exploration of what it actually looks like to live from that understanding, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a daily practice you can begin tonight. To understand where this idea comes from, it helps to look at the man who is most associated with it in the modern imagination, even though he never intended to write a book at all. Marcus Aurelius spent nearly 2 decades as emperor of Rome, managing wars, plagues, betrayals, and the exhausting demands of governing an empire that never seemed to stop asking for more of him. In the private notebook he kept, never meant for publication, he was not writing philosophy for an audience. He was reminding himself, night after night, of the same handful of truths he kept forgetting under pressure. He wrote to himself about not being disturbed by the actions of others, about controlling only what could actually be controlled, about the shortness of life and the foolishness of wasting it on resentment. What is striking is not that he discovered some secret the rest of us lack. It is that even a man with nearly unlimited power needed to keep reminding himself of the same basic truths over and over, because the mind does not stay convinced. Understanding something once is not the same as living it. That is why practice matters more than insight. Centuries earlier, a merchant named Zeno lost everything when his cargo ship sank off the coast of Greece, taking with it the entire fortune he had built his life around. By most accounts, this should have been the end of his story, a man ruined by circumstance, left with nothing. Instead, stripped of the identity he had built around wealth, he wandered into a bookshop in Athens, encountered ideas about virtue and reason that reshaped how he saw his own disaster, and eventually began teaching in a public colonnade, a stow from which the entire philosophy would take its name. The shipwreck that could have destroyed him became, instead, the doorway into a life he considered far richer than the one he lost. This is not a coincidence worth glossing over. The philosophy that would eventually help emperors govern with composure and slaves endure captivity with dignity was born from someone losing everything material and discovering that his sense of self did not have to sink with the ship. That connection to captivity is not incidental either. Epictetus, one of the most influential Stoic teachers, began his life enslaved, his body legally owned by another man, his physical freedom entirely absent, and yet the philosophy he taught, once he gained his freedom and began instructing students, centers on a distinction that remains one of the most useful tools available to anyone struggling with a difficult life. He taught that some things are within our control, our judgments, our responses, our choices, our efforts, and everything else, other people's opinions, our reputation, our health, external events, ultimately is not. Peace of mind, he argued, comes not from controlling everything, which is impossible, but from directing your energy entirely toward the narrow band of things that are actually yours to influence. A man who had experienced the most extreme form of external powerlessness arrived at a philosophy centered on internal freedom, and that is not a detail to skip past quickly. It is the entire argument in miniature. Seneca, a statesman and advisor during one of Rome's most politically dangerous periods, brought a different dimension to this tradition, one concerned less with abstract control and more with the practical management of time, anger, and anxiety. In his letters, he returns again and again to a particular observation, that people are far more careful guarding their property than guarding their time, even though time is the one resource that, once spent, can never be recovered. He wrote about anger as a temporary madness, something that feels justified in the moment and looks absurd in retrospect. He wrote about anxiety as suffering in advance, paying an emotional cost for disasters that, more often than not, never actually arrive. Seneca eventually died under the order of an emperor he had once tutored, and by most accounts met that death with the same composure he had spent his life writing about, which is perhaps the most convincing argument any philosopher can offer, that they were willing to leave and die by their own words. It would be incomplete to speak only of Stoicism here, because a strikingly similar insight emerged independently, centuries earlier, on the other side of the world. The Buddha taught that suffering arises not from pain itself, which is often unavoidable, but from our resistance to pain, our craving for things to be different than they are, our attachment to outcomes we cannot guarantee. He distinguished between what later teachers would call the first arrow and the second arrow, the first being the unavoidable difficulty life presents, a loss, an insult, an illness, and the second being the additional suffering we inflict on ourselves through resistance, resentment, and rumination. The first arrow often cannot be avoided. The second arrow, in a great many cases, is optional, and recognizing that distinction is the beginning of a very different relationship with pain. Two traditions, separated by geography, language, and centuries, arrived at strikingly similar conclusions about where human suffering actually originates. And that convergence should tell you something about how close they were both getting to a genuine truth about the mind. There is a fifth figure worth including here. Not a philosopher in the traditional sense, but a man whose life became an unintentional laboratory for testing these exact ideas under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist, was deported to concentration camps during the Second World War, stripped of his family, his possessions, his profession, and very nearly his life. In the years afterward, reflecting on what he had witnessed, he observed something that startled him. Survival did not correlate neatly with physical strength or circumstance alone. It correlated, in many cases, with whether a person could still locate some thread of meaning or purpose even inside unimaginable suffering. He came to describe the last of human freedoms as the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, even when literally everything else has been taken away. This is the same core insight running through Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and the Buddha, arrived at not through study in a library, but through direct, brutal experience, which is perhaps why his account of it remains so difficult to dismiss as merely theoretical. Modern psychology, working from an entirely different starting point, has arrived at conclusions that echo this ancient insight almost precisely. Aaron Beck, one of the founders of cognitive therapy, spent decades studying depression and anxiety and found that the emotional distress his patients experienced was consistently mediated by automatic thoughts, quick, often unconscious interpretations of events that occurred before the emotional reaction and largely determined its intensity. Two people could experience the identical external event, a rejection, a mistake, a piece of criticism, and have entirely different emotional responses depending on the interpretation each mind attached to it. This is not a coincidence of language. It is the same discovery the Stoics made 2,000 years earlier, now measured, studied, and applied clinically to help people suffering from depression and anxiety disorders. When Beck's patients learned to identify and question their automatic interpretations, rather than accepting them as simple fact, their emotional suffering measurably decreased, even when their external circumstances had not changed at all. Understanding why this works requires a basic look at how the mind actually processes threat. The brain did not evolve for modern life. It evolved to keep early humans alive in an environment full of genuine physical danger, and the systems responsible for that survival, particularly a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala, are extremely fast and extremely indiscriminate. They cannot easily distinguish between a genuine physical threat and a socially uncomfortable email, a critical comment, or an imagined future catastrophe. The same alarm system fires in both cases, flooding the body with stress hormones designed for a fight that is not actually happening. This is why a rude comment from a stranger can leave your heart racing for an hour afterward. Even though nothing physically dangerous occurred, your body responded to a threat that existed only as an interpretation, a judgment, a story about what the comment meant. Once you understand that this reaction is largely automatic and not a reliable signal of actual danger, you gain the ability to question it rather than simply obeying it. There is a second piece of psychological research worth including here, because it explains why simply knowing about a bias is rarely enough to overcome it. Daniel Kahneman, whose decades of research eventually earned a Nobel Prize, described the mind as operating through two distinct systems, one fast, automatic and intuitive, and the other slow, deliberate, and effortful. The fast system is what fires the moment that text message arrives, or the email lands, or the traffic stalls, generating an immediate emotional interpretation before the slower, more reflective system has even had a chance to engage. This is precisely why willpower alone so often fails as a strategy. You cannot out-muscle a system that operates in milliseconds using a system that requires deliberate, conscious effort to even switch on. What actually works is building a habit, a repeatable pause, that reliably invites the slower system into the room before the fast system's interpretation is allowed to run the entire show uncontested. That pause is not a personality trait some people have and others lack. It is a skill, built through repetition, exactly like the exercises about to be described. This is where practice becomes essential, because understanding a concept intellectually and being able to apply it in the middle of a stressful moment are two entirely different skills. Here is the first exercise, designed specifically for the moment something disturbs you, right as it is happening. When you notice a strong emotional reaction rising, before you say anything or make any decision, pause and silently ask yourself a single question. What did I just tell myself about this? Not what happened, but what story did your mind immediately attach to what happened? Often you will find the actual event was fairly neutral, and the disturbance came entirely from an interpretation your mind added within a fraction of a second, an assumption about someone's intentions, a prediction about the future, a judgment about what the event says about you. This exercise works because it interrupts the automatic chain between event and reaction just long enough for you to see the judgment clearly, rather than being carried along by it unexamined. The pause itself, even just 3 or 4 seconds, is often enough to shift the entire trajectory of your response. The second exercise addresses the recurring patterns, the situations that disturb you again and again over weeks or months. Not a single sharp moment, but a slow accumulation of the same worry returning night after night. For this, set aside 10 minutes, ideally at the end of your day, and write down the specific thing that keeps returning to your mind. Then, beside it, write 2 separate lists. In the first, write everything about this situation that is genuinely within your control, your effort, your preparation, your response, your choices going forward. In the second, write everything that is not within your control, other people's decisions, outcomes that depend on circumstances beyond you, the passage of time itself. This exercise works because recurring anxiety is very often the mind's attempt to control something through worry that cannot actually be controlled through worry at all. Seeing the 2 lists side by side, in your own handwriting, tends to make the futility of that effort visible in a way that simply thinking about it rarely achieves. Over time, this practice trains your attention to redirect itself toward the column that actually matters. It is worth returning briefly to the woman at her kitchen table, because these two exercises would have changed her evening entirely. Pausing to ask what story she had just told herself, she might have noticed that busy is not the same word as pulling away, and that her son's 6-word message contained no evidence at all for the narrative she had built around it. And if this particular worry about her son had been a recurring pattern, showing up not just tonight but for months, the second exercise would have shown her something equally important, that whether he prioritizes her the way he used to is largely outside her control to determine through worry, while how she reaches out to him, how she expresses her own needs clearly, and how she responds when he does have time, remain entirely hers. The difference between a ruined Sunday evening and a peaceful one was never really about the text message. It was about which of these two habits of mind she had practiced enough times to reach for automatically. Beyond these two exercises, there is a nightly ritual worth building into your evening, something the Stoics themselves practiced with remarkable consistency. Seneca described reviewing his day each night before sleep, not to punish himself for mistakes but to examine them honestly, the way a doctor might examine a wound, with curiosity rather than cruelty. Before you sleep tonight, take 5 quiet minutes and walk back through your day. Ask yourself what moment today disturbed your peace the most, and why. Ask yourself whether your reaction in that moment matched the actual size of the event, or whether your mind added something to it. Ask yourself what you would do differently if that same moment happened again tomorrow. And finally, ask yourself what, despite everything difficult about today, you can genuinely be grateful actually went well. These questions are not meant to generate guilt. They are meant to generate awareness, the same kind of quiet, honest attention Marcus Aurelius brought to his own notebook each night, not writing for anyone else, simply trying to see his own mind a little more clearly than he had the day before. There is a reason this nightly review matters more than it might first appear, and it has to do with how memory itself works. Left unexamined, the mind tends to store the day's events along with whatever emotional interpretation was attached to them in the moment, not the more accurate interpretation you might arrive at with a little distance and reflection. This means that without a deliberate nightly review, your accumulated memory of your own life slowly becomes a record of your automatic reactions rather than an accurate record of what actually happened. Over months and years, this compounds into something that can feel quietly and without any single dramatic cause, like a life full of slights, disappointments, and near misses. When a more honest accounting would reveal something considerably gentler, the nightly review is not simply a wellness habit. It is a correction applied daily, against a mind that would otherwise keep filing away distorted versions of your own days as though they were fact. Underneath all of this lies something most people never quite name, even when they sense it. The hidden root cause of so much daily suffering is not the events themselves, but an unconscious belief that peace of mind should be conditional, that it is something to be earned once circumstances finally align, once the difficult email is answered, once the health scare resolves, once the relationship stabilizes, once enough boxes are checked to finally be allowed to relax. This belief, rarely spoken aloud, quietly organizes an enormous amount of modern life, a perpetual postponement of peace to some future state that, once achieved, simply reveals a new set of conditions to be met. The central idea we began with, that you are disturbed by your judgments rather than events themselves, cuts directly against this. It suggests that peace is not something you earn through perfect circumstances. It is something available now, in this imperfect moment, the instant you stop insisting that circumstances must be different before you are allowed to feel calm. Think of a father standing in a hospital waiting room, having just been told his test results will take another 2 hours. He cannot control the lab, the doctor's schedule, or the result itself when it finally arrives. What he can control in that exact waiting room is whether he spends those 2 hours rehearsing every worst-case outcome his mind can generate, or whether he calls his daughter, steps outside for 10 minutes of fresh air, and lets the waiting be simply waiting rather than 2 additional hours of suffering added on top of an already difficult day. The outcome of the test will be exactly the same either way. Only his experience of the 2 hours changes, and that difference, though it changes nothing about the medical result, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the only things available to him in that room, and choosing it deliberately is not denial. It is where his actual power in that moment happens to live. This naturally raises an objection worth addressing directly, because it is the most common misunderstanding people carry about this entire way of thinking. Being calm does not mean becoming emotionless. It does not mean suppressing grief, pretending injustice does not matter, or performing indifference to things that genuinely deserve your care. The Stoics were not advocating for a life without feeling. Marcus Aurelius grieved deeply. Seneca wrote consolation letters to grieving friends with obvious tenderness. What they were advocating for was the difference between a feeling that arises naturally in response to genuine loss or injustice, and a feeling that is manufactured and amplified by exaggerated interpretation, catastrophizing, and resistance to reality. There is a profound difference between grieving a real loss fully and honestly, and spending 3 additional hours resenting a minor inconvenience because your mind decided it meant something about your worth. Calm, properly understood, is not the absence of feeling. It is the absence of unnecessary, self-manufactured suffering layered on top of genuine feeling. There is a related misconception worth addressing too, because it tends to surface as soon as someone begins practicing this way of thinking seriously. Separating what is in your control from what is not can sound, on first hearing, like an excuse for passivity, a reason to stop caring about outcomes you cannot guarantee. This is a misreading of the idea. Epictetus was not teaching indifference to results. He was teaching where to place your full effort, so that it is not wasted on what cannot be moved. A person preparing for a difficult conversation with a family member is fully within their control regarding how honestly and kindly they prepare their words, how calmly they show up, how clearly they listen. Whether the other person receives it well, changes their behavior, or reacts defensively is not something that can be guaranteed no matter how perfectly the conversation is handled. Pouring your full effort into your own preparation and conduct, while releasing your grip on guaranteeing someone else's reaction, is not giving up. It is the only place your effort was ever going to be effective in the first place. None of this exists purely in the mind, disconnected from the body, and it is worth being practical about that connection. 2 changes in particular tend to make this entire practice significantly easier to sustain. The first is attention to your breath in the exact moment a strong reaction begins to rise. A slow exhale, longer than your inhale, activates a physiological response that naturally counters the stress activation happening in your body, giving your thinking mind a few extra seconds to engage before your automatic reaction takes over completely. This is not a metaphor. It is a simple, repeatable physical tool available to you in any moment, in any room, regardless of what is happening around you. The second is a daily walk, ideally without your phone, even if only for 10 or 15 minutes. There is something about rhythmic movement through space that seems to loosen thoughts that feel stuck when you are sitting still, and many of history's most reflective thinkers, including several of the figures discussed today, were known for walking as a form of thinking. You do not need to solve anything on the walk. You simply need to let your body move while your mind is given room to settle. There is one more piece worth adding to the mind-body picture, because sleep itself is often where this entire practice quietly falls apart if it is ignored. A mind that has spent the day accumulating unexamined judgments rarely settles easily at night, and a body that has not moved rarely produces the kind of deep, restorative sleep that makes the next day's practice easier to sustain. This becomes a cycle either way. A restless night makes the following day's automatic reactions faster and harder to catch, which produces more unresolved disturbance by evening, which makes the next night more restless still. Protecting a consistent wind-down period before bed, dimming lights, setting aside screens, allowing the nightly review to happen in a quiet room rather than while scrolling, is not a minor detail. It is what makes everything else in this practice sustainable rather than something you manage to do for 3 focused days before old patterns quietly take back over. Bring all of this together, and a coherent way of meeting your days begins to emerge, one piece connecting naturally into the next. First, you recognize that your disturbance comes not from events themselves, but from the judgments your mind adds automatically and almost invisibly. Then, in the moment something disturbs you, you pause and ask what story you just told yourself, interrupting the automatic chain before it fully takes hold. For the patterns that recur night after night, you separate what is genuinely within your control from what is not, and you redirect your energy accordingly. Each evening, you review your day honestly, without cruelty, simply to see yourself a little more clearly than the day before. Underneath it all, you stop waiting for perfect circumstances to grant yourself permission to feel calm, understanding that peace is available now, not as the absence of feeling, but as the absence of suffering you were quietly manufacturing on your own. And you support all of this with a body that is breathing slowly and moving daily, because the mind and body were never really separate to begin with. So tonight, when you lie down in that same bed, in that same room, and your mind inevitably starts reaching for tomorrow before today has even finished, you now have something you did not have this morning. You have a single question you can ask yourself in that exact moment. What am I telling myself about this? And is that story actually true? You do not need to have every answer figured out tonight. You simply need to notice gently, honestly, the way Marcus Aurelius noticed in his own quiet notebook centuries ago, one small observation at a time. That is how a life quietly begins to change, not through one dramatic transformation, but through 1,000 small moments of noticing, repeated patiently, night after night, until noticing itself becomes the way you naturally meet your days. Let tonight be the first of those nights. If tonight's reflection stayed with you, there is a good chance the next one will too. Consider staying a little longer, because the ideas that shape a calmer, steadier life rarely arrive all at once. They accumulate quietly, one videoing, one honest question at a time. And there is always another piece of this same conversation waiting whenever you are ready to continue it.